The oppressive silence in Aurea, Boston's most aggressively modern temple of gastronomy, was a physical thing. It pressed down on the diners, silencing the clink of silverware and the murmur of conversation. Every waiter froze, their bodies locked in a tableau of service. At the center of it all, in the glass-walled private dining room known as the Perch, Elias Sterling, a titan of the tech industry, pointed a dismissive, manicured finger at his daughter before turning his venom on the waitress. His voice, a low growl accustomed to commanding boardrooms, sliced through the curated quiet. He spoke of heritage as if it were a stain, of tradition as a weakness, his words a cascade of contempt. No one moved. No one breathed. Then, the waitress, a young woman who looked as if a strong wind might break her, slowly lifted her head. The fire that kindled in her eyes was about to incinerate a billionaire's carefully constructed world and rewrite her own destiny. Amara Khalil was not a fighter. At 22, her life was a quiet battle, fought on multiple fronts: late-night study sessions for her community college courses, a mountain of medical bills for her grandmother, and the constant, grinding fatigue of working 2 jobs in a city that prized pedigree over perseverance. Life as the sole caretaker for her ailing city, her grandmother, in their cramped apartment in Roslindale, was a world away from the gleaming towers of the Seaport district where she now worked. When she'd landed the server position at Aria, it felt like winning the lottery. Perched atop the new Omni Boston Hotel, Aria was a statement piece, a restaurant that served not just food, but an ideology. Its brand was global fusion, a concept that translated to deconstructed Middle Eastern dishes served in minimalist portions for maximum prices. The staff, clad in severe charcoal-grey uniforms, moved with the silent precision of a special ops team. The head chef, a Frenchman named Jean-Pierre who had once spent a week in Beirut, spoke of elevating the cuisine, which Amara understood to mean stripping it of its soul. The pressure was immense. Every detail was scrutinized, from the angle of the fork to the precise description of the sumac-dusted foam that accompanied a single scallop. But the tips were a lifeline. A good night at Aria could cover her city's co-pays for a month. For that, Amara was willing to endure the condescension of the clientele and the sterile atmosphere that felt like a betrayal of the very culture the restaurant purported to celebrate. Each shift, she would arrive early, polishing the handleless coffee cups, a modern, soulless interpretation of the traditional finjan, and memorizing Jean-Pierre's overwrought descriptions. She learned the rhythms of the wealthy, how they signaled for a check without making eye contact, how they discussed multi-million-dollar deals over a $28 hummus platter. It was a performance, and Amara, like her ancestors, was a performer. She likened the meticulous, choreographed movements of fine dining service to the ancient coffee ceremony her city had taught her. Every gesture had a meaning. Every step was deliberate. Every interaction, a carefully measured blend of respect and humility. In a few short months, Amara had distinguished herself. She was efficient, observant, and possessed a quiet dignity that seemed to soothe even the most difficult customers. Her first $500 tip from a visiting Saudi prince, who was amused by her ability to discuss the nuances of different cardamom varieties, went directly into an envelope labeled City's Heart Meds. Away from the cold gleam of Aria, Amara's world was warm and fragrant. Their small apartment was dominated by the presence of her grandmother, a woman whose body was failing, but whose spirit remained as formidable as the Lebanese mountains of her youth. Siti Fatima occupied the only bedroom, while Amara slept on a worn-out sofa in the living room. The tiny kitchen was their sanctuary, a place where the air was thick with the scent of garlic, lemon, and 7 spice, and the sounds of Fairuz on an old cassette player. It was there that Amara had learned about the woman her grandmother had been, a revered figure in her village, not for wealth, but for her mastery of kahwa, the traditional Arabic coffee ceremony. It was a ritual of hospitality and respect, an art form passed down through generations of women. Siti Fatima was known for her ability to create a coffee that was not just a beverage, but a story, a welcome, a negotiation. Ya Amar, my moon, her grandmother would say, her gnarled, arthritic hands guiding Amara's. This is not just coffee. This is our honor. She taught Amara how to select the green beans, how to listen for the first crackle as they roasted in the pan, the secret to the perfect light gold color. She taught her the rhythm of grinding the beans with a brass mortar and pestle, a sound that was a traditional announcement of welcome to any passing traveler. The sound of the mortar is the music of generosity, Habibti. It tells the world, this house is open, this house has a heart. She had learned the precise ratio of coffee to cardamom, the 3 boils in the long-handled dalla, and the intricate etiquette of serving. You held the dalla in your left hand, the stack of finjans in your right. You served the eldest or most honored guest first. You poured only a small amount, a sign of respect, implying that the coffee was precious and the guest was welcome to stay for more. The first cup was for the guest, the second for the soul, the third for the sword. Each had a meaning, a history. Those lessons were Amara's inheritance, a treasure more valuable than any stock portfolio. They had sustained her after her parents' death in a car accident when she was 16, leaving her as the sole protector of her grandmother. The ritual of making coffee was her connection to them, to her heritage, to a sense of self that felt perpetually under siege in a country that wanted her to be either a sanitized, palatable version of her culture or completely invisible. Working at Aria was a paradox, a way to use the ghost of her culture to provide for the woman who had gifted it to her. She had no inkling, as she clocked in on that crisp October evening, that the sterile imitation was about to collide with the sacred original. The night was electric with a nervous energy that meant big money. The entire perch had been booked for a private event, and the staff whispered that Elias Sterling was hosting an engagement party for his daughter. Sterling was a legend in Boston's tech scene, a self-made billionaire who had founded a revolutionary AI company. He was also, the whispers said, a man who had ruthlessly scrubbed away his own past. Born Elias Suleiman, the son of Syrian immigrants who ran a small bakery in Worcester, he had changed his name in college, married a Boston Brahmin, and systematically distanced himself from the Arab-American community. He was held up as a model of assimilation, a man who had transcended his background. To those he'd left behind, he was a man who had sold his soul. Tonight, his daughter Jessica was getting engaged to a young man from a family whose lineage traced back to the Mayflower. The party was a strategic merger, a final seal on Sterling's ascent into the highest echelons of American society. The menu was a carefully curated performance of culture, Jean-Pierre's interpretations of dishes Sterling's own mother had probably cooked, now rendered unrecognizable and priced astronomically. Amara was not supposed to be working the party. She was assigned to a section in the main dining room, a series of quiet two-tops. But then, disaster struck. Mark, the senior server assigned to the perch, slipped on a micro-drop of olive oil in the kitchen, his ankle twisting with an audible crack. He was out of commission, and the party was already arriving. The manager, a perpetually stressed man named David, scanned the floor, his eyes wide with panic. His gaze landed on Amara. "Khalil, you're up! The perch! Now! Don't screw this up!" Her heart hammered against her ribs. She smoothed her apron, took a deep, steadying breath, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The room was a spectacle of understated wealth. A long table was set for 40, adorned with minimalist floral arrangements and candles that cast a soft, flattering glow. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Boston skyline glittered like a carpet of diamonds. At the head of the table sat Elias Sterling. He was in his late 50s, lean and predatory, with silver hair swept back from a tanned forehead. He wore a dark, tailored suit that whispered its expense rather than shouting it. Beside him was his daughter, Jessica, a lovely, fragile-looking girl of about 23, her expression a mixture of anxiety and resignation. She kept twisting a colossal engagement ring on her finger. Her fiancé, a blandly handsome young man named Chip Winthrop, sat beside her, looking perfectly at ease, as did his impeccably dressed, old-money parents. Also at the head table, seated to Sterling's right, was a man who made Amara's breath catch. It was Farouk al-Jamil, a philanthropist and community elder, a man who had built a business empire without ever changing his name or forgetting his roots. He was a legend in the Arab-American community, a quiet force who funded arts programs and scholarships. What was he doing here, at the table of a man like Sterling? Amara knew. He was the ultimate validation. If Farouk al-Jamil attended, it signaled to the Winthrops that Sterling, despite his background, was acceptable. Amara approached the table, her posture perfect, her expression serene. "Good evening," she said, her voice a low, steady melody. "My name is Amara, and I will be your server this evening." Sterling didn't even look at her. He was in the middle of a story, gesturing to the Winthrops. "The key is to disrupt the existing paradigms. We didn't just build a better mouse trap. We convinced the world it didn't need mice." Chip's father chuckled appreciatively. Amara stood patiently, a silent, invisible cog in the machine of the evening. After a moment, Mr. Al-Jamil turned his kind, intelligent eyes to her. "Thank you, my dear," he said in Arabic, a small, subtle act of acknowledgement. "We are in your capable hands." Sterling flinched almost imperceptibly at the sound of his native tongue, as if it were a discordant note in his carefully composed symphony of success. He gave a curt nod in Amara's direction. "Just bring the wine. The Sancerre for the whites, and the Opus One for the reds. Don't bother with the presentation." As she turned away, she heard him say to the Winthrops, "You have to try the kibbeh. Of course, it's not the heavy, greasy stuff you get in those ethnic joints. Jean-Pierre does it with a quail egg and a truffle reduction. Very refined." The words were like small, sharp stones pelting her. Ethnic joints. He was talking about restaurants run by people like her own family, places where food was about community and sustenance, not status. She bit her lip and proceeded to the wine station, her hand steady despite the tremor in her heart. The dinner service unfolded with tense precision. Amara moved like a ghost, refilling water glasses, clearing plates, anticipating needs before they were voiced. She watched as Sterling performed for his future in-laws, explaining his own culture to them as if he were a tour guide in a foreign land. She saw the discomfort in his daughter's eyes, the way she barely touched her deconstructed food. She saw the quiet, observant gaze of Mr. Al-Jamil, who ate with polite appreciation, but whose eyes missed nothing. After the main courses were cleared, the moment arrived. It was time for coffee and dessert. The other servers brought out trays of Jean-Pierre's creations, saffron-infused panna cotta, pistachio macarons, and a chocolate dome that melted when hot caramel was poured over it. Then came the coffee service, gleaming silver thermoses of drip coffee and a clattering espresso machine rolled in on a cart. Sterling waved it away with a flick of his wrist. No, we'll have something traditional, a nod to our heritage." He turned to Amara, a magnanimous, performative smile on his face. "Bring us some Arabic coffee, the real thing." Amara's training kicked in. "Of course, sir. Chef Jean-Pierre has a version he prepares with a hint of orange blossom." "No," Sterling cut her off, his voice sharp. "Not the chef's version. I want proper Arabic coffee. Surely a place like this can manage that." It was a test, a power play. He was putting the restaurant, and by extension her, on the spot. David, the manager, who had been hovering nearby, hurried over. "Mr. Sterling, our traditional coffee service is not something we typically offer for large parties. It's quite a process." "Then make it happen," Sterling said, his voice dangerously low. He wanted to show the Winthrops an authentic experience, curated and controlled by him. A frantic 20 minutes later, another server emerged from the kitchen, carrying a large, ornate but obviously decorative dalla and a tray of mismatched finjans. The coffee that was poured was dark and bitter, smelling faintly burnt. It was clear someone had simply boiled some Turkish coffee grounds in a pot and added a sprinkle of stale cardamom. Amara watched as Sterling took a sip. His face tightened. He glanced at Mr. Al-Jamil, who took a polite small taste and placed his cup down, his expression unreadable, but deeply eloquent to anyone who understood. The coffee was an insult. It was a cheap imitation, a caricature. Sterling's face flushed a dark, mottled red. The carefully managed evening was slipping. He had failed the test of authenticity in front of the one man whose respect he craved and the family he was desperate to impress. And all that rage, all that humiliation needed a target. His eyes, cold and furious, scanned the room and landed on Amara. "This is what I'm talking about," he said, his voice resonating with a sudden, shocking venom. He held up the small cup. "This garbage. This is what happens. Our people come to this country, and we forget everything that matters. We lose our standards. We lose our pride." He gestured broadly at Amara. "Look at her. A pretty girl in a uniform, serving fancy food to people like us. I bet her grandmother knew how to make real coffee. I bet her grandmother knew the honor in it. But what does this generation know? Nothing. They know how to take an order and smile. They're hollow. They've traded their heritage for a paycheck." The room went utterly still. The air crackled. Amara felt as though all the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs. He wasn't just insulting her. He was desecrating the memory of her parents, the honor of her city, the very core of her identity. This man, who had jettisoned his own name, who had turned his back on his community, was accusing her of being hollow. Jessica Sterling whispered, "Dad, please stop." But he was on a roll, the words pouring out of him, fueled by shame and wine. "I ask for one simple thing, one piece of our culture, and this is what they give me. A joke. It's pathetic. This waitress, she probably thinks Arabic coffee comes from a pod. She has no idea what she's lost. She doesn't even know how to know." He looked directly at her, his eyes filled with a chilling contempt. "Tell me, can you even do it? Could you serve coffee the proper way, with the proper respect? Or have you forgotten that too?" For a lifetime, Amara had been taught to be silent, to endure, to absorb. Survival was a bowed head. But as Sterling's words echoed in the suffocating silence, she thought of Siti Fatima's hands, gnarled but steady, teaching her to pour. She thought of the rhythmic music of the mortar and pestle, the sound of generosity. She thought of her grandmother's voice. "This is our honor." Something inside her, a core of steel she didn't know she possessed, refused to bend. It snapped upright. The wine glass in Amara's hand was delicate, expensive. She set it down on her service tray with a soft, deliberate click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and met Elias Sterling's furious gaze with an unnerving calm. "With all due respect, Mr. Sterling," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it resonated with a clarity that cut through the tension. "You are mistaken." A collective gasp rippled around the table. David, the manager, looked as if he might actually collapse. Staff did not contradict a guest. Ever. Especially not a guest who could buy the entire hotel and turn it into his personal parking garage. Sterling's eyes narrowed into slits. "Excuse me," he hissed. "You are mistaken about me," Amara continued, her pulse thrumming a frantic rhythm against her skin, but her voice remained impossibly steady. "And you are mistaken about what it means to remember. Some of us don't have the luxury of forgetting. Some of us hold on to our heritage because it is all we have." Every eye was locked on her. Jessica Sterling was staring, her mouth slightly agape, a flicker of something, admiration, perhaps, in her tear-filled eyes. Chip Winthrop looked utterly bewildered. His parents appeared scandalized. And Mr. Al-Jamil. Mr. Al-Jamil leaned forward ever so slightly, his expression one of intense, focused interest. "My grandmother, Fatima Khalil, taught me," Amara said, her voice gaining strength. "She taught me how to select the beans, how to roast them, how to grind them. She taught me that the sound of the mortar is the music of welcome. She taught me the meaning of the 3 cups, the importance of honoring your guest, and the humility of the host. She taught me that our traditions are not a performance for outsiders. They are the language of our soul." Sterling rose slowly from his chair, his 6-foot frame radiating menace. "How dare you?" he seethed. "You are a waitress. You will be fired before you can draw your next breath." "Perhaps," Amara said, her gaze unwavering. "But first, I will answer your question. You asked if I could serve coffee the proper way. The answer is yes." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. "The real question is, would a man like you even recognize it if I did?" The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a direct challenge, not just to his authority, but to his very identity. Sterling was momentarily speechless, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He was about to unleash a torrent of fury, but before he could, a calm, authoritative voice spoke from the head of the table. "I would," said Farouk Al-Jamil. He addressed Amara directly, his voice imbued with a quiet dignity. "Young lady, I would be very interested to witness what your grandmother taught you." The shift in the room's power dynamic was seismic. Sterling had been performing for the Winthrops, but his true audience, the man whose validation he sought, was Al-Jamil. And Al-Jamil had just sided with the waitress. Sterling was trapped. To refuse now would be to admit that his own posturing about tradition was a sham. It would be a profound loss of face in front of the one man he couldn't afford to alienate. His jaw worked, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He looked from Al-Jamil's serene face to Amara's defiant one. "Fine," he spat out, the word clipped and venomous. "Show us. Show us all what a real Arab woman knows. But if this is some kind of trick, I will personally ruin you." Amara simply nodded. She turned to David, the manager, who was now a pale, sweating statue of indecision. "I will need a few things from the kitchen," she said, her voice all business. "A shallow pan for roasting, a brass mortar, and pestle. You have one on display in the lobby. Green, unroasted coffee beans, whole cardamom pods, and a proper dalla, not a decorative one." David looked at Sterling, who gave a jerky, furious nod of assent. The manager practically sprinted from the room. While they waited, Amara moved with quiet purpose. She untied her grey server's apron and folded it neatly, placing it on a side table. She pushed back the sleeves of her uniform blouse. She cleared a small space on a sideboard, creating a stage. The guests watched, transfixed, as if preparing for a sacred rite. David returned with the requested items, his hands trembling as he set them down. The brass mortar and pestle gleamed under the soft lights. The green coffee beans were pale and unassuming. Amara ignored the portable burner the kitchen had provided. Instead, she asked for a single, long-stemmed candle. She lit it, the small flame dancing in the silent room. This was how her city did it when the power went out, a small act of defiance against the dark. She placed the shallow pan over the flame, a slow, patient process. She poured the green beans into the pan. "First you listen," she said, her voice filling the quiet. She wasn't speaking to Sterling anymore. She was speaking to the room, to anyone who would hear. "The beans will tell you when they are ready." She began to stir them gently with a wooden spoon, a constant, rhythmic motion. The room was so quiet that everyone could hear the soft hiss of the beans against the hot metal. A faint, grassy smell began to fill the air. Then came the first pop, a tiny crackling sound. "That is the first crack," Amara explained. "Some stop here for a very light roast. We will wait." She continued to stir, her focus absolute. The beans began to darken, turning a pale cinnamon, then a warm brown. The aroma in the room was changing, becoming nutty, rich, and intoxicating. Then a second, more rapid series of cracks began. "This is the second crack. Now we are close." She watched them with an eagle's eye, and at the perfect moment, when they were a beautiful, even golden brown, she swept them from the heat into a wooden bowl. Next, she took the mortar and pestle. She dropped in a few pods of cardamom first, crushing them to release their fragrant oil. Then, she added the still warm coffee beans. She lifted the heavy brass pestle, and then the music began. Clack, 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 dong, clack, 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 dong. It was not random pounding. It was a rhythm, complex and steady, a beat that echoed with centuries of desert hospitality. It was the sound Siti Fatima had called the music of generosity. It filled the room, a primal, resonant heartbeat that was the antithesis of Arya's curated silence. The guests were mesmerized. Elias Sterling stood frozen, his face ashen. It was a sound he must have heard in his childhood, a sound he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. When the coffee was ground to a fine powder, Amara transferred it to the dalla, added water, and placed it carefully over the candle flame. "Now, we watch for the 3 boils," she said. She brought the coffee to a boil, then removed it from the heat to let the foam settle. She repeated the process twice more. On the 3rd time, she let it rest for a moment, allowing the grounds to settle to the bottom. The ritual was almost complete. She took a stack of the small, handleless finjans. Holding the dalla high in her left hand, the cups in her right, she approached the table. She ignored Sterling. She ignored the Winthrops. She walked directly to Farouk al-Jamil. She bowed her head slightly in a gesture of respect and poured a small amount, no more than an inch, of the steaming, fragrant coffee into the first cup. She offered it to him with her right hand, her left hand tucked behind her back. Mr. al-Jamil took the cup. He looked at the golden liquid, inhaled its rich, cardamom-laced steam, and then looked at Amara. A slow, profound smile spread across his face. He took a sip, closing his eyes for a moment. He did not speak, but his expression said everything. This was the real thing. Amara then moved to the next eldest at the table, one of Sterling's elderly aunts, and served her. Then she served Mr. Winthrop Sr., a gesture of respect to an honored guest. She moved around the table, serving with a grace and poise that was utterly captivating. Her movements were economical, precise, and imbued with a deep sense of purpose. When she finally reached Elias Sterling, he looked like a broken man. His arrogance had evaporated, leaving behind a raw, painful vulnerability. He watched her as if she were a ghost from his past, a spectre of the heritage he had murdered. She poured his coffee and offered it to him. His hand trembled as he took it. He lifted the cup, the scent filling his nostrils, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. He took a sip, and a shudder ran through his body. It was the taste of his mother's kitchen. The taste of a life he had rejected. The taste of everything he had lost. Amara finished serving everyone and returned to the sideboard, standing quietly, her work done. The silence that followed was different from the one that had started the ordeal. It was no longer tense and oppressive. It was reverent, filled with a shared sense of wonder. Finally, Mr. Al-Jamil set his cup down. He rose to his feet and began to applaud, not the polite, restrained applause of the wealthy, but a genuine, heartfelt ovation. One by one, the other guests rose and joined him, their applause filling the room. Sterling's relatives were weeping openly. Even the Winthrops, who could not possibly understand the full cultural significance of what they had witnessed, were on their feet, their faces filled with awe. Jessica ran from her seat and threw her arms around Amara, sobbing into her shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice choked with. The applause, when it came, was a tidal wave of sound in a room that had been holding its breath. It was led by Farouk Al-Jamil, a man whose quiet approval was worth more than any fortune, and it crashed over Amara, leaving her standing by the sideboard, trembling in its wake. The adrenaline that had sharpened her voice and steadied her hands began to recede, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and the terrifying, vertiginous feeling of having stepped off a cliff into thin air. Jessica Sterling, her face a mess of mascara and revelation, rushed to her and embraced her with the desperate strength of a drowning woman finding a life raft. "Thank you," she sobbed into Amara's shoulder, the words muffled by the starched fabric of her uniform. "Thank you. I never knew." An elderly woman with Elia Sterling's eyes, one of his aunts, approached and took Amara's free hand, her own wrinkled and papery, pressing it between both of hers. "Allah yatik Allah fia, binti," she whispered, her voice thick with the accent of the old country. "God give you health, my daughter. Your grandmother would be so proud. You have her hands. You have her spirit." Amara could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears. She felt disconnected, as if she were watching a scene from someone else's life. Then the crowd of well-wishers parted. Elias Sterling stood before her, the architect of her humiliation and the catalyst for this surreal triumph. The predatory confidence had been stripped from him, leaving a man who looked hollowed out, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like a costume on a stranger. In front of his family, his future in-laws whose waspish faces were masks of polite bewilderment, and the man whose respect he had so desperately courted, he bowed his head. It was not a shallow nod of concession, but a deep, complete inclination of shame, a gesture of utter surrender. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a ragged, broken thing, unrecognizable from the boardroom growl that had sliced her to pieces an hour earlier. He swallowed, struggling for words. "There are no words. For my cruelty, for my ignorance. I have never been more wrong in my entire life." He looked up, and his eyes, the same eyes as the kind aunt, now swimming in a grief that seemed decades deep, met hers. What you did, that was not about coffee. It was about honor. An honor I sold for stock options and a house in Weston. An honor you, a young woman I tried to break, have kept alive with such impossible grace. He took a shuddering breath. You are more a Suleiman than I have ever been a Sterling. The name, his true name, hung in the air between them, a ghost summoned back from a shallow grave. It was a confession, a eulogy, and a plea all at once. The magnificent edifice of Elias Sterling had crumbled to dust, and in the ruin stood Elias Suleiman, the baker's son from Worcester, finally, horrifically, seeing himself. The Winthrops, seeing their meticulously planned evening devolve into a raw, ethnic family drama they couldn't comprehend, began to make their excuses. Chip gave Jessica a hesitant pat on the shoulder, his expression one of complete befuddlement, before being steered away by his mother, whose tight smile did not reach her scandalized eyes. Their departure was a quiet, surgical removal from the scene, the sound of a future, a merger dissolving. Sterling barely seemed to notice. He was still looking at Amara, his gaze desperate. I have spent 40 years running, he confessed to her, though the whole room listened. Running from the smell of garlic and 7 spice in my mother's kitchen. Running from the sound of my father's language. I told myself it was for my children, to give them a better life, an easier path, free from the baggage I carried. He glanced at Jessica, who had disentangled herself from Amara, but remained close, a silent guardian. But I didn't give you an easier path, did I? I gave you an empty one. I robbed you of your own story. I gave you wealth, but I denied you your riches. His wife, a woman who had been a silent porcelain doll all evening, stepped to his side and placed a hand on his arm. Tears traced paths through her foundation, but they seemed to be tears of relief, as if a long, silent tension in her marriage had finally snapped. Sterling turned back to Amara, his focus absolute. What I did tonight was unforgivable. I used my power to project my own deep, rotting shame onto you, and you responded with a lesson I was too arrogant to learn from my own parents. He hesitated, the billionaire dealmaker suddenly lost, adrift. I have no right to ask you for anything, but I am asking, not as a customer, but as a father who has failed his child. Would you teach her what your grandmother taught you? Not just the method, the meaning, the stories, the honor. I will pay you anything. I will set up a fund. I will do whatever it takes to give her back the piece of herself I stole. Jessica's eyes pleaded with Amara. Please, she whispered, watching you. It was like feeling a phantom limb for the first time. Amara looked from the broken father to the searching daughter. She thought of her city, whose greatest joy was in the sharing of knowledge. Her anger, which had been a white-hot flame, had cooled into something else, something closer to a weary pity. These were not monsters. They were just lost. Heritage isn't for sale, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice soft but firm. You cannot buy it back, but if your daughter truly wishes to learn, I would be honored to teach her. Before the relief could fully dawn on Sterling's face, Farouk al-Jamil stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Sterling's shoulder. This is a good start, Elias, he said, his voice a calm anchor in the emotional storm. A very good start. But a wound this deep requires more than a private bandage. He looked around the room, at the other relatives, at their children who looked as lost as Jessica. What this young woman holds is not just a family recipe. It is a key a treasure for our entire community. Perhaps your amends should be broader." The suggestion hung in the air, a challenge and an opportunity. At that moment, David, the manager, who had been oscillating between terror and awe, finally found his footing. He approached Amara, his entire demeanor changed. "Miss Khalil," he said, his voice laced with a respect she had never heard from him. I think we need to fundamentally rethink your role at this restaurant. Chef Jean-Pierre and we have been talking. What you did tonight, that is not service. That is art. That is history. We would like to create a new position for you. Cultural ambassador. You would train the staff, host demonstrations, curate a part of the menu, name your price. Amara's head swam. An hour ago, she was a waitress facing ruin. Now, she was being offered a new career, a chance to be paid for the very essence of her soul. Elias Sterling looked from Amara to Mr. Al-Jamil, and a flicker of his old decisive energy returned, but it was transformed, redirected. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a humble, focused purpose. This was a problem he could solve, not by erasing the past, but by building a future. "You're right, Farouk," he said. "This is bigger than my family." He turned back to Amara, his eyes clear for the first time all night. "Miss Khalil, Amara, with your permission and under your guidance, I want to fund a foundation, a place to preserve and share these traditions. We will call it the Fatima Khalil Foundation, in honor of your grandmother. We will offer classes in coffee, cooking, music, calligraphy, language, to any child who wants to learn for free. We will pay you to lead it. We will build a bridge back to the world I tried to burn to the ground." The journey home to Roslindale that night felt like traversing dimensions. The cool leather of the car service Sterling had insisted on, a sleek, black Escalade, felt alien against her skin. She stared out the window as the gleaming, sterile towers of the seaport gave way to the triple-deckers and vibrant, messy life of her own neighborhood. She was still wearing her charcoal grey uniform, but it felt like a costume from a play that had ended. In her hands, she clutched a check David had pressed into them, an advance for her new role, for an amount that made her feel nauseous and giddy all at once. She let herself into the small apartment, the familiar scent of garlic, lemon, and her city's rosewater lotion wrapping around her like a comforting blanket. Her grandmother was asleep in the bedroom, the soft rasp of her breathing a steady rhythm in the quiet apartment. Amara didn't wake her. Instead, she went into the tiny kitchen, their sanctuary. She took out the worn brass mortar and pestle, the real one, not the decorative piece from the hotel lobby. She measured out a small handful of green beans. Under the dim light of the single bulb over the sink, she began the ritual again. Not for an audience, not for a lesson, but for herself. She roasted the beans in the small pan, listening for the first and second crack. She let the rich, nutty aroma fill the small space, chasing away the sterile ghost of Aria. Then she began to grind. Clack, 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 dong. The rhythm was slower this time, more contemplative. It was the music of her ancestors, the sound of generosity, and tonight it was the sound of her own heart, finding its beat again after the chaos. Each strike of the pestle was a processing of the night's events, the humiliation, the rage, the fear, the strange, terrifying power of her own voice, the broken man and his searching daughter, the dizzying offers. As she ground the beans, she ground the turmoil of the evening into something manageable, something she could understand. She prepared the coffee, the 3 boils, the patient settling. She poured a single, small finjan for herself, the first cup for the guest. Tonight she was a guest in her own life, a stranger to the woman she had become in the space of a few hours. She drank it slowly, the bitter, fragrant liquid a communion with her own soul. It tasted of honor, and it tasted of an uncertain, terrifying, and brilliant future. The first lesson did not take place in the Sterling's palatial Western home. Amara had insisted. 2 weeks after that night, on a crisp Saturday afternoon, Elias and Jessica Suleiman, he had insisted they use the name when with her, pulled up to her Roslindale apartment building in a modest sedan, not the Escalade. Jessica was dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, looking young and nervous. Elias wore a polo shirt and slacks, but he looked as out of place as a wolf in a petting zoo. The deep shame was still etched on his face. It had settled into the lines around his eyes. Amara met them in her own kitchen, the heart of her world. Siti Fatima sat in her armchair in the corner of the living room, a silent, regal observer, her dark eyes missing nothing. The air was thick with the scent of a lamb stew Amara had been simmering. It was a deliberate choice, an olfactory statement of identity. "Welcome," Amara said simply. The lesson was a disaster. Jessica's hands, accustomed to keyboards and touch screens, were clumsy and uncertain. She scorched the first batch of beans, filling the small apartment with acrid smoke. She struggled to find the rhythm with the mortar and pestle, the sound discordant and jarring, a frustrating cacophony instead of a welcoming music. Elias stood by the doorway, silent and rigid, his hands shoved in his pockets. Every scorched bean, every clumsy movement by his daughter, seemed to be a fresh indictment of his own failures. "I'm sorry," Jessica said, her eyes welling with tears of frustration after her third attempt to pour the coffee resulted in a spill. "I'm so bad at this." From the corner, Siti Fatima spoke for the first time, her voice a frail but clear rasp. She spoke in Arabic. "Shway shway, habibti. Little by little, my love. Your hands are learning a language they were never taught. Be patient with them." Amara translated, and Jessica looked at the old woman with a kind of desperate reverence. Amara guided Jessica's hands with her own, showing her how to hold the dala, how to tilt her wrist just so. "It's not about perfection," Amara said softly, echoing her grandmother's wisdom. "It's about intention. You are not performing. You are offering." At the end of 2 hours, they managed to produce a single, passable cup of coffee. It was a little weak, a little gritty, but it was theirs. Amara poured 3 finjans. She served Siti first, who took a sip and gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval that was as good as a standing ovation. She gave the second to Jessica, who drank it as if it were a holy sacrament. She offered the third to Elias. He took the small cup, his hand trembling slightly. He brought it to his lips and drank. He closed his eyes, and a single tear escaped, tracing a path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. "My mother," he whispered, his voice thick. She used to add a crushed clove when she was feeling sad. She said it was for warmth. It was the first story he had told, a small seed planted in the scorched earth of his past. The lessons continued, week after week. They became less about the coffee and more about the stories it unlocked. Elias began to talk, hesitantly at first, then with a torrent of memory. He spoke of his father's hands, perpetually dusted with flour. He spoke of the Syrian lullabies his mother sang. He was excavating his own life, and with Amara and his daughter as his witnesses, he was piecing himself back together. The Fatima Khalil Foundation opened its doors 1 year and 2 months after that night at Aria. Elias had been true to his word, pouring his wealth and logistical genius into its creation, but he had ceded all creative and cultural control to Amara. Guided by Farouk al-Jamil and a board of community elders, she had transformed a beautiful but neglected brownstone in the South End into a sanctuary. It was a place of warm woods and intricate tile work, the air fragrant with spices and ink and old paper. The opening was not a gala for Boston's elite. It was a community open house. The rooms were filled with the sounds of the oud, the laughter of children, and the murmur of Arabic, English, and the beautiful, messy fusion of both. Amara, now the executive director, moved through the crowd not as a server, but as a host in the truest sense of the word. She had found a new kind of poise, a confidence that came not from defiance, but from purpose. Her work at Aria continued on a consulting basis, but this foundation was her heart. The main event was a coffee ceremony, performed in the central atrium. Siti Fatima, regal in her wheelchair, was the guest of honor. Amara began the ritual, her movements now familiar and deeply calming to the assembled crowd. But this time, she did not perform it alone. Halfway through, Jessica Sulaiman, moving with a quiet grace that had been earned through months of patient practice, took over, grinding the beans with a steady, welcoming rhythm. When the coffee was ready, Amara served the first cup to her grandmother. Then Jessica took the dala, and with a steady hand, she served the second cup to her father. Later that evening, as the crowds thinned, Elias found Amara standing by a window overlooking the garden. He was holding a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "I have something for you," he said. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a dala, old and battered, the brass darkened with age and use, a small dent near the spout. "This was my mother's. She brought it from Homs. I found it in a box in my attic. I haven't looked at it in 40 years. He held it out to her. "I don't think this is about me giving my daughter back her heritage anymore," he said, his voice quiet with a hard-won wisdom. "It's about her building her own. It's about me finally honoring mine. You didn't just teach us how to make coffee, Amara. You taught me that a memory is not a ghost to be feared, but an ancestor to be honored." Amara took the old coffee pot, its weight familiar and sacred in her hands. She looked from the man who had once been her tormentor to the beautiful, thriving space around her, filled with the echoes of laughter and the promise of stories yet to be told. She thought of that night, of the fury that had forged her voice, of the terror that had given way to strength. She had learned that heritage was not a static thing to be remembered or forgotten, a relic in a museum. It was a living, breathing fire. For years she had been its quiet keeper, tending a small, precious ember, passed down by her city. But Elias Sterling, in his cruelty, had thrown gasoline on it. He had forced her to give it air, to let it roar. And she had discovered that the purpose of a flame is not merely to survive in the dark. It is to light other candles, to spread warmth, to illuminate the way home. And in the soft glow of the foundation that bore her grandmother's name, she could see that the path ahead was bright,